Chaos in the Commons over Gaza debate, with furious shouting, mass walkouts and the Speaker left fighting for his job. This is Politics Live. Joining me in the studio, Conservative Deputy Chairman Matt Vickers, Labour MP Rosie Duffield, Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and The Telegraph's Tim Stanley. Today, angry scenes in the House of Commons last night as a debate on Gaza descends into chaos. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, is under pressure over the part he played.
Can you please advise me, where on earth is the Speaker of the House of Commons? How do we bring him to that seat?
It was my wish to do the best by every member of this House.
So, what was supposed to be a day of debate and a vote on one of the biggest foreign policy issues of the day, whether to call for an immediate ceasefire in Israel and Gaza, descended, as you saw there, into scenes of shouting, recrimination and chaos in the House of Commons, and calls for the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, to resign. It was all quite extraordinary. Let's take a look.
Let's be clear. That is the situation. It looks so bad on such an important issue.
Well, this is how one Labour MP responded. Jess Phillips tweeted this: "To say I'm ashamed of my workplace today would be an understatement." Now, in a few minutes' time, we're going to talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, who's in Central Lobby in Parliament, Henry Zeffman, to take us through exactly what happened in the Commons. But to start with, and with you, Matt Vickers, do you echo what Jess Phillips has said? Did you feel ashamed of your workplace yesterday?
I think so. I think that Lindsay Hoyle is very decent. Great guy, actually, who made a big mistake yesterday. And he made a big mistake, and the reason it's so tense is because people like me on the government benches walk through those lobbies and vote for things in Labour opposition days that we know these motions very often are put together to create pressure, to show things in the worst possible light. Our amendments are never put until the end. We have to do that. And as a result, my face gets plastered all over social media with statements of Matt Vickers voted for X, voted for Y. Usually it's completely misaligned to the facts of the situation, but that goes up there, it gets put out. Labour boost it all over the patch.
But before we get to the sort of he said, she said, who's to blame and so on and so forth, were you ashamed of your workplace yesterday or proud?
Do you know what? Parliament is an incredible place. The UK's Parliament is well, the mother of all parliaments across the world. People have followed our steps, and it works because of the independence of the Speaker. It works because of the conventions and all the standing orders. And yesterday, the Speaker made a mistake. Right,
so you were ashamed or embarrassed?
I'm proud as punch to be a Member of Parliament. I don't think that that's any reflection on the people who are in Parliament. I think it reflects on the Speaker, the mistake he made, and perhaps on the Labour Party's leadership and what they may or may not have done to influence
we will come on to all of this. How did you feel when you were in Parliament yesterday, either in the chamber or watching what went on? Did you feel proud or embarrassed of your workplace?
Not remotely proud. I was in the chamber and you just get this sinking feeling, and it felt to me very much like Brexit days all over again. You know, the public are watching that. They're watching us talking about something that most people have a really strong emotional connection to as an issue, and there we are falling about amongst ourselves, scrapping, leaving the chamber and having tantrums. It was really shameful.
Susie, what do you think the public will have made of it? Even if it wasn't completely clear what was going on, what do you think they will have thought?
Well, regardless of the situation with parliamentary process, they'll just think that it's unedifying on all sides. Whether anyone was playing political games or not, everyone's lost that game. Every single side has lost that game. Whether or not you are pro-Israel or pro-Palestine or somewhere in the middle, nothing there's been resolved. And while this was all going on here, there was a far more important vote in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, where Netanyahu's government was voting against ever allowing a Palestinian state. That's the kind of vote in parliaments that really has a huge impact on other people's lives. And when I was growing up, debates about foreign wars in our parliament also had an impact because we had influence on the world stage and it mattered. And I think that what we've got at the moment in parliament, apologise, I don't mean about the people that are sitting here, but we've got an awful lot of people who are just acting like babies and children who have no sense of the importance and the authority of that institution and who treat it with disdain, and therefore we treat them with disdain, and I think that's a pity.
Tim?
The war has been going on for about 5 months. I've done about half a dozen radio and television programmes about Israel and Gaza during that time. I don't think I've once ever discussed Israel and Gaza. I've always discussed the political implications in Britain. There's a tendency in life when something really extraordinary and awful is happening to sort of displace and to make it about you. And that's what it looked like Parliament did yesterday, that rather than debate actually the lives of people, it broke down to a debate about itself and about procedure. Now, I suspect that some people will leap on this to say this is an example of the institution being broken. I disagree with that very strongly. Where it broke down was where precedent was not followed. And one reason why it broke down, why this happened, is because either parties were playing politics with the issue or because MPs felt so intimidated by the public that they decided to do that Hoyle decided to do what he did. It's possible that some of the responsibility lies not just with politicians, actually, but with the voters.
We're going to discuss all this throughout the programme, but let's explain to viewers exactly what happened yesterday. Talk to Henry Zeffman, as I said, who's in Central Lobby, the BBC's chief political correspondent. Henry, why was everyone so angry in the House of Commons?
I think what we saw in the House of Commons yesterday, Jo, was a heady cocktail of party politics, geopolitics, arcane parliamentary procedure and fear. Everybody in the House of Commons chamber yesterday thought the stakes were very high because tensions are running very high, both here in Parliament and in the communities that they represent over the issue that they were discussing. The reason it became even more heated than we expected is because under parliamentary procedure, basically the Labour motion, which Sir Keir Starmer finally managed to unite almost all of his MPs behind, probably wasn't expected to be called. That wasn't the normal thing to happen. In fact, Sir Lindsay Hoyle's main constitutional advisor released his own note saying that he'd advised the Speaker not to do that. That's why the SNP and the Conservatives were so furious. That's why they ended up walking out. The sort of specifics of what votes were and weren't called around that's still a bit confusing, even to some of the MPs I've been speaking to this morning. What it certainly hasn't done is drain any of the sting from this issue here in Westminster.
We've heard from one of our guests on the panel, Matt Vickers, that he blames the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, for what descended yesterday. You have mentioned that he broke with parliamentary convention. He said to give MPs the broadest range of options possible. He's a much respected figure, but where is he today?
He's in deep trouble. He's in really deep trouble. Speaking to MPs here in Parliament, overwhelmingly Conservative MPs who feel this way, they are questioning whether he can last into next week as Speaker of the House of Commons. You've got almost 60 members of Parliament have signed a non-binding but nevertheless very pertinent motion saying that they don't have confidence in him. A Speaker of the House of Commons exists to command the confidence of MPs of all stripes that they will be a fair umpire. If they lose that, then things start to become very difficult for them. Worth remembering, as many viewers will, that John Bercow, who was the Speaker for a decade before Sir Lindsay Hoyle, he essentially lost the confidence of many MPs, many Conservative MPs, during some of his controversial decisions during the Brexit years. But Sir Lindsay Hoyle's whole kind of purpose in the Speaker's chair. The reason he won the election to succeed John Bercow by such a margin was because he was meant to be the antidote to that. Instead, you have the House of Commons more divided, more chaotically on matters of procedure than it ever was, even in the Bercow years. That's not what he was meant to be doing. That's why MPs are so angry.
Henry Zethman in Central Lobby, thank you very much. Well, let's just give you a flavour of exactly what Henry was talking about in terms of Sir Lindsay Hoyle's job being on the brink, really, because you need to command the confidence of MPs. The front page, the Daily Telegraph, Speaker on brink after walkout. We have the front page of the Express. No confidence, fury over Speaker's vote stitch-up. The Guardian. Fury in Commons forces Speaker to apologise over Gaza vote chaos. And finally, in the Eye, Commons chaos as MPs walk out of Gaza vote. Well, you heard in the headlines the leader of the SNP in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, demanding to know where the Speaker was way through the debate. Well, he did return. He came back to the Commons yesterday evening and he apologised. Let's listen to some of that.
I am honest to this House, I am true to this House, I believe in all members of this House, and I have tried to do what I thought was the right thing for all sides of this House. It is regrettable, and I apologise for a decision that didn't end up in the place that I wished for.
Well, that was Lindsay Hoyle apologising. He is meeting, or is due to meet, senior figures from all of the parties. Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House, said as much just a few minutes ago in the Commons. But he is facing an awful lot of pressure and certainly didn't do anything to allay the concerns of the SNP leader, Stephen Flynn. Let's take a look.
We have seen the SNP opposition day turn into a Labour Party opposition day. I'm afraid that that is treating myself and my colleagues in the Scottish National Party with complete and utter contempt. And I will take significant convincing that your position is not now intolerable.
Well, Stephen Flynn there. Let's talk to the SNP MP and frontbencher Richard Thompson. Richard, welcome to Politics Live. Do you have confidence in the Speaker of the House?
Any confidence I have, Jo, is ebbing away by the hour. I will do the man the courtesy of hearing what he has to say to my party leader at Westminster, Stephen Flynn, when they meet as expected later today. But he's going to have to do an awful lot of convincing, because what we saw last night was just absolutely shambolic. We came to the chamber from all parties and all compass points with perhaps different views on the situation in the Middle East. But what we should have been talking about and focused on was the plight of people in Gaza, the 30,000 men, women and children who've lost their lives, the hostages who continue to be held in captivity, and the necessity for an immediate ceasefire and the desirability or otherwise of a two-state solution. And instead, we're now mired in, the very worst of Westminster, talking about procedures. And all of this was eminently avoidable if only the Speaker had listened to the advice furnished to him by his clerks.
Right. I mean, just to go back to the issue, you say your confidence in the Speaker is ebbing away by the hour. Around 20 of your colleagues have called, at least 20, have called on the Speaker to quit. Are they right?
They will have reached that conclusion by themselves, and I can certainly understand how they have reached that conclusion. As I say, I hold the Speaker in high personal regard. This is certainly not anything that is personal about this. The way he stood up for members over their personal security on the estate and off the estate is admirable. But nevertheless, there was a significant blunder last night. But it's not just about that procedural blunder. It's about the very strong suspicion, as evidenced by Nick Watt, on the BBC's editor of Newsnight, that the Speaker came under considerable pressure from the Labour Party to depart from established procedure simply to do the Labour Party managers and Keir Starmer a favour. And that the Speaker has to be there to defend all parties in the House, without fear, without favour. And it does seem that he acted with fear and with favour last night.
Right. You have referred to the report by my colleague, Nick Watt, who had sources who said and who claimed that the Speaker could have been lent on by people within the Labour Party. That has been denied and refuted, of course, by the Labour Party, and we will talk about that a little later on in the programme. I just want to come back to this issue of people watching the programme may think, why couldn't the SNP just, in the best interests of the substance of the discussion and in terms of parliamentary democracy, put their own party interests aside and just continue with the debate on Israel and Gaza?
Well, that was what we tried to do, but this all fell apart at the stage when votes were being called, exactly as the clerks to the Speaker had prophesied would happen. Now, I will take issue with the suggestion about putting party issue first, because when this happened, we took the view as a group that we would actually vote for the Labour amendment. It was not our amendment, it was not our preferred amendment. It left some important elements out, like reference to what we believe to be the collective punishment of people in Gaza. But we were prepared to actually vote for the Labour amendment, and we hoped against hope Labour might actually vote for our motion if it came to it. So we were quite prepared to set that aside in the interest of getting to something approximating to the right place. But as I say, the real frustration here is, instead of talking about how the Labour Party leadership has been dragged to a position more in tune with where I think most people in the country are, instead of talking about that, instead of focusing on the dire and desperate situation in the Middle East, we're now talking about the shenanigans and about how the thumbscrews appear to have been applied to the Speaker by the Labour Party.
All right, Richard Thompson, thank you very much. And of course, if we hear anything from the meetings that Sir Lindsay Hoyle is due to have with the SNP and the government and the Labour Party, we will bring that to you. But first of all, you obviously have no confidence anymore in the Speaker, do you?
I'm deeply concerned about the decision that was made yesterday. I think the Speaker is a decent, genuine man. I think he's made a big mistake yesterday.
Yeah, but do you have confidence in him to continue?
I haven't signed any early day motion as yet.
As yet?
So jury's out there, I'm listening.
Right. Well, what was wrong, though, with the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, if we take what he said at face value, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, saying he wanted to give MPs the broadest possible options to discuss on Israel and Gaza. We're not going to go through exactly what each amendment and motion said, but he just wanted to open it up. What was wrong with that?
Because the way that things have been done in the House of Commons, since I arrived, I don't know how many times I've had to walk through the lobby on an opposition day that Labour have put forward that it aims to create pressure, aims to paint me in a bad light. And our amendment was never allowed to be put forward in those circumstances. And all of the men and women who sit on the benches beside me who've suffered abuse as a result of those opposition days being unamended first, why should they? Why is it different when the boots on?
Those things, when it's about, trying to say Matt Vickers voted for climate change or something like that, that's not as volatile and as likely to lead to violence as getting people to vote one way or another on Gaza and Palestine, is it? It's a very different situation.
There are things that, there's two issues there. Firstly, there are lots of my colleagues, women on my who have been abused for having voted on certain things to do with Opposition Day. We either decide that's part of the process or it isn't. But when the boot's on the other foot, you can't just change the rules overnight. And then secondly, if we are going to allow abuse and intimidation from outside to prevent us having the discussions in the way we normally would, that's a really big issue for democracy in this country, if we allow ourselves to be bullied and scared out of debates.
Tim?
There's nothing wrong, of course, with having as wide a debate as possible. The problem was he broke with precedent in order to make it happen, and it was perceived that he had done so because he'd been lent on by the Labour Party, so he was showing favour and partisanship towards one party. Another problem is he was advised against this by the clerks and he ignored that advice. Another problem, which speaks to the confusion many viewers will be having about this, is a lack of transparency and a lack of clarity about how procedure works. This wasn't explained clearly to people. So when it took me about 30 minutes to actually figure out what had happened. It's so impenetrable. The rules do work. They've been there for a long time. They do work. They are framed as they are for a reason, but they have to be clearly explained. His final problem, which might seem counterintuitive, is he apologised. I don't think he should have apologised. Ultimately, what the Speaker wants to do, he can do. He's not required to apologise. Bercow made many mistakes in his time as Speaker. never apologised. What he would do was get up and he would allow points of order for an entire hour and he would just take the abuse. Part of the problem with Lindsay Hoyle is he's too nice for the job. He's a very, very nice man, and you could tell in his speech he was becoming emotional.
Very.
You could sense, if it is true that Starmer had this meeting and spoke to him about the threats to my MPs, you could sense his sense of responsibility for the security of MPs, you could sense his embarrassment about what had happened, and you could sense that he was really moved by the suggestion that people might have lost confidence in him personally. I'm sorry, but a speaker needs to be someone who can just say, I've made my decision, and this House will abide by it.
Rosie, what do you make of the reports that he was lent on by Labour figures?
I think all political parties were leaning on him. I mean, we know that opposition day debates are basically there to score points, but the stakes on this were incredibly high. It's a gamble. Everything changes all the time. Allegiances, which amendment people are voting for, it's changing. Gossip and rumour fuel that. And the Speaker had an incredibly difficult position to try and work out what to do. And I know him, and his number one concern is our safety. I think Matt's alluded to this. We need a wider discussion about democracy and how safe we are, because democracy is at stake when you are threatened with death and all kinds of hatred, and that stops you voting the way you might want to.
Right. Lobbying the Speaker, as you say, happens all the time.
Yeah.
People want certain amendments chosen, but being lent on by Labour figures, that's a much more serious allegation.
And I hope that didn't happen.
Right, but you're not completely sure?
I don't know. I'm not in those inner circles. I'm not going to pretend to be. And I think everyone does things that they shouldn't do in situations like this.
Right, well, Pat McFadden, who is a senior Labour frontbencher, these reports, the allegations by my colleague Nick Watt, were put directly to him earlier today on the Today programme.
You will know that Nick Watt of the BBC reported that actually what went on in that meeting between Keir Starmer and the Speaker is effectively a threat. If you don't let us get our motion and, in effect, therefore stop the split of the Labour Party in an embarrassing way, we won't back you as Speaker when and if we're in government.
That's categorically untrue. I heard those rumours yesterday, as you would expect. I checked on that before coming on this morning. It is categorically untrue.
Pat McFadden there, but how desperately did Labour want to avoid a split in its ranks? For election, right?
I mean, we know that the party is split on this issue. I've got friends and colleagues who wanted to vote for our motion and also the SNP motion, and they were denied the ability to do that in the end. I don't know if it's true what Richard from the SNP just said about some people were voting for the Labour amendment. I hadn't heard that at all. That sounds quite convenient to sort of add in now, but heightened tension was awful, and my colleagues were frightened yesterday.
And I mean, there are also claims against the government or against the Conservative Party and MPs who walked out because they came to the conclusion that they were going to lose MPs on your side voting for other amendments. So it's rich to be holier than thou over this.
I think that's a ridiculous
no,
suggestion from the Labour Party. I think that's ridiculous.
Well, it's not
there
just
was,
the
of
Labour
course,
Party.
people who will and won't have voted for such a motion. Yesterday there was 3 choices, all quite similar in the end. 3 choices put before people. The Speaker in this instance chose to allow Labour to have its say on its amendment. But what about, you know, we talked about the safety of MPs. We're talking about the safety of the Labour MPs who might be on the end of that. There are Conservative MPs in constituencies who are on the end of the same abuse, threats and intimidation. He didn't do them any favours yesterday.
Right, well, I mean, that was raised by many people, including the Speaker himself. He was worried, he said, about the safety of MPs. The Conservative MP, Charles Walker, also reiterated this point in the Chamber of how scared MPs were feeling about voting on the ceasefire. Let's have a listen.
Whips are frightened for their flocks. They are frightened for their flocks because members of Parliament now feel that they have to vote in a certain way to safeguard their safety and the safety of their family.
I mean, this is serious, isn't it? I mean, we've already had Mike Freer, Conservative MP, saying that he is going to stand down at the next election because of intimidation. Tobias Ellwood, another Conservative MP, whose house was blocked by protesters. He couldn't reach his home, again around this issue. Labour MPs who say they've been under huge pressure to vote in a particular way. Have we reached a tipping point on this?
I think on this particular issue, there definitely seems to be, there's just far too much blood in the water, isn't there? And it's attracting too many of the wrong sort of kind of conversations and people to it. But one of the points of an opposition day, as Matt has said and Rosie said, is to put a party in an impossible hole that you cannot get out of without looking bad in some way. And that's what the aim of yesterday was. And at by the same token, the Speaker was in an impossible hole yesterday. If he had had MPs of all parties who go and see him regularly, and if he had heard them say to him, you know, that there's potential for death threats or problems in my constituency, or my kids had something said to them at school or whatever it might be, and said, but you know what? Don't care. We're going to let the SNP do its thing. We're going to play political games. We're going to let the Tories and the SNP make Labour look bad, and you know you'll all get your day at an opposition day later in the week, or whatever it might be. We'd be having an entirely different conversation, but there'd have been just as much upheaval and violence and upset and horror. There wasn't a way out of this for Lindsay Hoyle. So I feel quite sorry for him because, as everyone said, he's a decent guy. He's tried to do the best thing. It's gone wrong. But there's no way it could have gone right.
Right. And what about...
Politically, the SNP are the big winners because not only can they point to the Tories and Labour being on the wrong side of history on this issue, but now they can also play the card of Westminster with its arcane practices, deprived us of our voice, and once more Scotland's locked out. So there is a political upside to this for them.
All right, let's talk about the safety of MPs. Personal experiences, Rosie, for you and many others. What is it like?
I had a letter yesterday from the Crown Prosecution Service to say that a case of a death threat against me and Jo Rowling and Joanna Cherry is in fact going to court, and the threshold is pretty high. So most of the kind of threats I get, I don't always report all of them, and the ones you report you don't expect to hear anything else, but this particular one is being taken seriously. So I thought it was ironic that I got the letter yesterday to say we'll let you know when the court date is through, and that was in my pocket when I was in the chamber. And, you know, all of these things are on your mind at some level. You try to, none of us are wallflowers. All of us are tough, otherwise we wouldn't be in Parliament. I am not a shrinking violet. But it's always there at some level. And we've all been through Brexit. We've been through the times where we before were told to only leave by certain entrances and exits. And here we are again. And it does wear you down, I have to be honest.
It does wear you down. I mean, what's it like? You also refer to the safety of MPs, the pressure that you are under to vote a certain way. What's it like every day being an MP?
Do you know what? I think at the beginning it's horrifying. When the first threat comes through or the first bit of abuse occurs in the street, it's and then over time, I think to some extent you become slightly numb to it and you realise it's part of the day. And actually, you probably feel more for the people around you, in that we make the decision to do what we do. The people around us do not make the decision to have a son or a wife or a husband who goes out and puts themselves at risk with some of this stuff. So I think it's tougher for the people around you probably than it is for you.
Right. I mean, it is party politics, of course, and it is a rough game. We know that. It's adversarial in its feel and in its look. The safety of MPs and MPs feeling genuinely frightened, even if you're numb to it in the way that Matt has just explained. But is there a balance between the two? Or are people just going to be put off going into politics altogether?
Of course they are. And everything you've described is totally unacceptable. One thing I want to add is that no one is more horrible to MPs than other MPs.
Yes.
And you should hear, I'm a sketch writer, I sit in the lobby, I watch debates. You should hear the things that MPs say about other MPs, accusing them of being traitors, accusing them of being soft on paedophiles and murderers, accusing them of killing the disabled through government cuts.
Unfit to run the country, we had this morning.
Right, OK. So MPs do this to MPs all the time. And then MPs come out and say, but we've got to be kind.
Yeah.
And I'm so worried about the mental health of different people. I just think of one example,
So true.
Saint Chris Bryant, who famously used parliamentary privilege to suggest that Nigel Farage had received £500,000 from the Russian government. This was completely untrue. It had consequences because when Nigel Farage was debanked by Coutts, that claim was mentioned in Coutts' dossier on Nigel Farage.
Fine.
That is an attack upon a private citizen. And it's the kind of thing that MPs do to people outside of Parliament and to each other all the time. And they shouldn't receive the abuse they receive, fine. But if we're really going to go down this path now of saying we need to talk about politics and how do we clean it up, it's going to have to begin with politicians.
Right. Well,
being nicer
well, let's
to
ask,
other politicians.
Do you accept that, both of you?
Yeah, absolutely. The Lib Dems did a campaign about sewage, and I know lots of my Tory colleagues and friends, some of whom sit on the EFRA committee with me, so they are really, really bothered about and active in that sphere of sewage and stuff. And the Lib Dems made out that they didn't care. They got all kinds of pylons. I've been ashamed of some of our campaigns where we've made personal comments about people that we know to be completely decent, and MPs sometimes rebel and don't put those messages out from their party, because that does not help. And if we're going that low, we can't really complain about other people going that low.
And I was just pick on what Matt said earlier about this point about motions and voting against and things. This is something which perhaps doesn't get understood. That the opposition will put a motion that will say something like, we must be nice to cats and not kill cats. Right? And then the government MPs come out and they vote against it, or they abstain or whatever, because it's not a real motion. It was never supposed to pass. And then an opposition MP will put up a tweet saying, your local MP hates cats.
Politics by social media.
What are you going to do about that?
Yeah.
It's not even just the tweet. It's the Facebook sponsored post that's got my face slammed next to it. The message, and they pay to shovel this into the faces of people.
Well, I mean, to put it crudely, have you brought some of this on yourselves in terms of the discourse? I don't mean the death threat, but what I mean is the sort of thing that Tim is talking about. What responsibility can you take not to engage and indulge in this kind of thing? I don't know if you ever have.
I think you're entirely right. I think politicians and the nature of the dialogue and the discourse it's for the gutter, isn't it? And I think that's why we end up with what we end up with. Some MPs are much more averse to those sort of things than others, but the entire thing's nasty, divisive, and opposition days are just the prime example of people put on the end of a stick to be beaten. You know, it just doesn't work.
There be some kind of different rules than maybe about opposition days, because that's what happened yesterday. Someone using a really volatile situation and issue to cause problems with another party politically. Nothing to do with helping Israel and Palestine at all. Exactly. Everything about provoking each other. And that's what happens to all parties on opposition days. So there's got to be some kind of rule. You don't do that.
Let me just bring our guests and viewers up to date, because Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, has apologised again in the House of Commons. Tim says stop it, but he's ignoring you, I'm afraid, at the moment, under huge pressure as he is. And we've also had reaction from the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Let's take a listen.
I can categorically tell you that I did not threaten the Speaker in any way whatsoever. I simply urged him to ensure that we had the broadest possible debate, so that actually the most important thing, which is what do we do about the awful situation in Gaza, could be properly discussed by MPs with a number of options in front of them. That's the right thing to do. The Speaker did the right thing in making sure the debate was broad. But the tragedy is the SNP walked off the pitch because they wanted to divide the Labour Party and they couldn't, and the government walked off the pitch because it thought it was going to lose a vote.
Sir Keir Starmer again rejecting any claim or allegation that the Speaker was threatened by him or anyone else in the Labour Party. He did also just talk about the importance of returning to the actual debate itself, which is the situation in Israel and Gaza, and the importance of that debate, even if foreign policy wasn't going to change as a result in the UK or the course of the war directly. But this, interestingly, came from Tom Fletcher, who was the UK's ambassador to Lebanon from 2011 to 2015, who said, UK Parliament, Gaza, none of this matters? Not true. Friends of mine in Israel, Palestine and region messaging that they're watching closely, especially those who want to isolate hardliners in Israeli cabinet and Hamas and get back to work on a two-state solution. Well, let's catch up with the latest, if any, in negotiations when it comes to any pause or prospect of it in the fighting and the release of those hostages still being held by Hamas. Our news correspondent, Jenny Hill, joins me now from Jerusalem. Jenny, first of all, the negotiations. Any update?
Well, the talks are continuing. Joe Biden's most senior Middle East advisor is in the region. He's in Israel today for talks. Yesterday he was in Egypt. So for that matter was the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. He was talking with Egyptian officials. A member of Israel's war cabinet, Minister Benny Gantz, has sounded an extremely cautiously optimistic note. I mean, just listen to his language. He says that the preliminary signs indicate a possibility of progress towards a deal. That deal, of course, being a temporary ceasefire and the return of Israeli hostages. But the pressure's on because Israel's Prime Minister has repeatedly insisted that if those hostages aren't returned by the beginning of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan, which begins next month, then he intends to send ground troops into the southern city of Rafah, which is currently sheltering well over 1 million displaced Palestinian civilians. That gives negotiators, in effect, just over a fortnight to get that deal done.
Yes, huge pressure on Israel. The UK has airdropped aid into Gaza for the first time since the massacre on October the 7th. What can you tell us about that, Jenny, and the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza?
Yeah, the Jordanian Air Force dropped aid which was paid for by Britain. It was very specifically targeted at a Jordanian-run hospital in the north of Gaza, food, fuel, medical supplies and so on. There have been a number of similar airdrops, but when you look at the scale of what's required on the ground in Gaza, according to aid agencies, you know, it simply isn't enough. The World Food Programme has now suspended its aid deliveries to northern Gaza, saying that the breakdown of civil order makes it impossible for them to send food in. They'd actually just resumed food deliveries on Sunday after a 3-week pause. But when those trucks went in, the convoys went in, they were immediately surrounded by crowds of people trying to get at the stuff on board. Officials said that they were encountering violence, chaos, and that they'd witnessed unprecedented scenes of desperation. Many aid agencies and indeed foreign governments, as you know, are increasing their pressure on Israel, saying that the humanitarian situation on the ground now is deteriorating, and that it's not just the Israeli airstrikes which are risking the lives of civilians. Hunger and disease are also doing so now too.
Jenny Hill, thank you very much for joining us there from Jerusalem with the latest both in Gaza and on negotiations that are ongoing. Let's return to Westminster and what unfolded last night and show you this headline from the Institute for Government, written by Dr. Hannah White. Party political game playing over Gaza conflict brings Parliament into disrepute. We can talk to Hannah White. Welcome to you. Why are you saying that? Why has it left the reputation of Parliament and confidence in tatters?
Well, I think it was just extremely unedifying to watch the parties trying to gain political advantage over each other over a debate which was about this, as you've just been hearing from your correspondent, this desperate situation and this terrible conflict which is going on in Gaza. Everybody ended up cross at the end of the day, apart from potentially the Labour Party, who avoided having to have a vote which might have split their MPs. But really, the SNP, the Conservative Party, and the Speaker were left cross or diminished by the whole process. And I just think it was a terrible night for Parliament.
I mean, I think most people think it was not a good night for Parliament. You're absolutely right, Hannah. I mean, Rosie Duffield, who's sitting here in the studio, has been talking about the pressure on MPs, but also some of the procedures that were being brought to bear. Are they outdated? Are they just not fit for the sort of modern discourse? Again, my other guest here, politician Matt Vickers, saying it's all about what appears on social media. It's all about the pressure being brought to bear in the way that MPs vote. Are the procedures of the House of Commons and Parliament just not really fit for all of this?
I think there's a strong case to be made for that. I think that the key problem yesterday was that we were trying to impose a parliamentary procedure designed really to deal with binary questions, with yes-no questions, from an era when we typically had two main parties sitting in the House of Commons, and we were trying to apply that procedure to a debate where there were many more nuanced points to be made and discussed, and there were actually 3 different versions of the words that the House wanted to be able to decide on. It has long been the case that House of Commons procedures have been bad at dealing with anything other than binary questions. You can look back at House of Lords reform, you can look at the indicative votes we had during the Brexit period. Anything which isn't yes, no is very difficult for the House to deal with. That's the one point. The second point is, as you indicate, is what does this do these procedures enable the House to have the debates and to make the decisions it wants to be able to have on these crucial issues, which are of great interest to lots of people around the country? And I think the answer you have to conclude from looking at what happened yesterday is no. It's only a shame that it took what happened yesterday for people to recognise this and for the Speaker to say, well, actually, we need to review this procedure. It would be much better if it happened sooner.
Tim?
I strongly disagree. I think the procedures of Parliament are designed precisely to avoid what happened yesterday. Parliamentary procedure is shaped in order the debate should be orderly and it should be well-mannered and respectful. The problem was the procedure wasn't followed. That's partly because of mistakes made by individuals, but it's also because we're attempting to debate an issue which just will break down any parliamentary structure. To me, one of the most stupidest questions I ever hear in the Commons, and I hear it a lot, is what is the Prime Minister doing to achieve a two-state solution in the Middle East? It's so stupid. The British Prime Minister is not going to do that. He can't. It's not within his gift. And so the issue isn't just can Parliament cope with this debate. It's what role does really Britain have post-Empire in the Middle East, and are we raising expectations of what Britain can do too high? And quite frankly, is British politics being unhealthily shaped by a debate about what's happening in a country far, far away? And why is that happening? That, I think, is a more interesting question than should we tinker with the procedures of Parliament.
Rosie?
That's a brilliant point, and I absolutely understand Tim's kind of unshaking faith in parliamentary procedures, but that's against an ocean of social media and the pressure that we feel behind us of that ocean. I mean, debates are not debates anymore. They're 2 or 3 minute speeches where you have to get certain social media savvy phrases in that you've seen in emails to you so you can put it on a social media clip, which is partly why very often I choose not to go into the chamber for these debates. They're not debates, they're social media clip discussions, and that's not proper cognitive thinking about these deeply important issues.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the huge issue in Gaza and Israel, but in real terms, yesterday's debate was about us just casting an opinion. All these opposition days make no difference to policy, make no difference to what the UK is doing.
So are they not worth having?
They're there to be had, but I think the fact that when all of the things that we're facing in this country go on, the biggest thing that we're talking about today is something that's going on at the other end of the world, and actually last night's vote had no influence on it at all.
Can I just say, without the opposition motions, Parliament would just be driven entirely by the executive and its business. So the Parliament does those in part in order to allow MPs who are not part of the government to have a say. It's about us being a parliamentary democracy, not just an elected executive.
I mean, one of the points, Susie, is are we all operating in silos and echo chambers? This idea that the art of persuasion seems to have disappeared. It seemed to disappear to a large extent during the Brexit years. Another issue that Parliament struggled with to resolve. And maybe, again, does it need review in terms of how it operates to deal with a constitutional question and a big foreign policy issue?
Well, first, I just say, talking about things that happen a long, long way away is relevant. It does have an impact on the rest of the world, and our allies do take that into account when they're making their decisions and policies and everything else. But in terms of what's happening here in our debates, I think it's because we've had, in recent years, especially since Brexit, political parties that want to be as tribal and as binary as possible on major, massive, nuanced constitutional things, and they're actually being torn apart by their own, insistence on going down rabbit holes. And if our parties just start saying, do you know what, this is complicated, and having that kind of debate, and perhaps not whipping quite so much as they do, perhaps treating opposition days with a bit more respect, then we wouldn't have this kind of situation. And in the same token, they would be safer in their constituencies and they wouldn't get the same kind of violent threats.
An important point on that, is choosing candidates for the next election. Do you align this way on Brexit, this way on immigration? Nothing is necessarily binary like that.
Very briefly, Hannah, a final thought from you.
I mean, I think it's absolutely right that Parliament needs rules by which people can hold their debate. But Parliament's changed. We now have 3 parties who, are sitting there. We used to have 2-party politics. We must change the procedures to enable Parliament to have the debate to make the decisions it wants to make.
All right, Hannah White, thank you very much. We've just got time to hear from Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP in Westminster.
We do not, on these benches, therefore, believe that you can continue in your role as Speaker. We do not have confidence in your ability to do so. So I would therefore welcome clarity either from yourself or indeed from the Leader of the House, as to how we can best facilitate a vote in this chamber at the earliest possible occasion to that effect.
Well, that was just in the last few minutes. Very clear there from Stephen Flynn. He doesn't have confidence in the Speaker. How's this going to end?
If I was the SNP, I'd probably feel the same. They didn't come out covered in glory, so they're bound to feel like that, but I disagree.
You disagree?
Yeah.
All right. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of our guests for joining me on this important day in the fallout from last night and those scenes of chaos in the Commons. Bye-bye.